getStaticPaths is another function Next.js understands, just like getStaticProps and getServerSideProps. And getStaticPaths is a function you need to export in a page component file if it's a dynamic page, like we have it here, and you're using getStaticProps. Not if you're using getServerSideProps, and not if you're using neither getStatic nor getServerSideProps, but it is needed if you do use getStaticProps. So in that case, you need to export another function here in this page component file, and that's the getStaticPaths function. And this can also be an async function so that you can use async await in there. Now, what's the deal with getStaticPaths though? To understand it, let's again think about the fact that with getStaticProps, a page is pre-generated during the build process. Now, what does this mean? This means that, of course, Next.js needs to pre-generate all versions of this dynamic page in advance for all the supported IDs. Because since this is dynamic, Next.js needs to know for which ID values it should pre-generate the page. Because how would it pre-generate this page otherwise? We get the ID from the URL here, great, but keep in mind that this is not pre-generated when a user visits this page with a specific value in the URL, but during the build process. So here we need to pre-generate it for all the URLs, for all the meetup ID values users might be entering at runtime. And if they enter an ID for which we didn't pre-generate a page, they will see a 404 error. But because that is how it works, we need to add getStaticPaths, which has the job of returning an object where we describe all the dynamic segment values. So all the meetup IDs in this case, for which this page should be pre-generated. Now for this object needs to have a paths key, which is an array. And in that array, you must have multiple objects, one object per version of this dynamic page, where this object has a params key, that's a must-have, which then itself again is an object with all the key value pairs that might lead to your dynamic page. So if you have multiple dynamic segments, then you would have multiple keys in this nested object. Here we only have meetup ID as a single dynamic segment, and hence here in this params object, we would add a meetup ID key and then enter the concrete value for meetup ID for which this page should be pre-generated. And if we have multiple possible values, like in this case where I have M1 and M2, we would return a paths array with two objects inside of it, where the other one uses M2 as a meetup ID. Now in reality, you would of course not hardcode this as a developer, but you would also fetch your supported IDs from a database or from an API and generate this array dynamically. And we are also going to do that later, but for the moment, let's hardcode it. With that, if you save that file with getStaticPaths added with this code, and with getStaticProps still being in there, with that, if you now reload, we don't get this error anymore. Instead, we get this error regarding the fallback key instead of getStaticPaths. And that's another piece of configuration which you need to add in this returned object next to your paths key, the fallback key. This key tells Next.js whether your paths array contains all supported parameter values or just some of them. If you set fallback to false, you say that your paths contains all supported meetup ID values. That means that if the user enters anything that's not supported here, for example M3, he or she would see a 404 error. If you set fallback to true, on the other hand, Next.js would try to generate a page for this meetup ID dynamically on the server for the incoming request. Fallback is a nice feature because it allows you to pre-generate some of your pages for specific meetup ID values, for example, the pages which are visited most frequently, and then pre-generate the missing ones dynamically when requests for them are coming in. Here, however, I'll set fallback to false to indicate that I defined all supported paths here. Now, if you want to learn more about fallback and so on, I do cover that in greater detail in my full course, but the general concept is that we can simply define some paths instead of all paths if we, for example, have hundreds of pages and we don't want to pre-generate all of them, but maybe just our most popular pages. And therefore, with fallback added now, if we save this again and reload, now we successfully load the page for this first meetup. If I go to M2, that also works. But if I enter M3, I get the default 404 page here because I had fallback set to false and M3 is not one of the supported parameters here. That's how this works. And getStaticPaths therefore is another important function which you need in dynamic pages to tell Next.js for which dynamic parameter values this page should be pre-generated. And then again, getStaticProps executes for every page, so for every meetup ID value, allows you to fetch data for that meetup and allows you to return props for that meetup. And as a side note here, where I log the meetup ID, we do see that here in this terminal. We don't see it in the browser developer tools. Here the console is empty because I mentioned that this is code, the code inside of getStaticProps, which runs during build time. And when running in the development server, it does run for every incoming request, but only on the developer server side. So we only see it in the terminal of this developer server then, and not in the browser. That's how getStaticProps works for dynamic pages, and that's how getStaticPaths works and why it is required.